The narcissistic son tried to take over the elderly man's house, and he didn't know what would happen next. Have you ever experienced someone you trusted completely, suddenly starting to abuse that trust? How your own child, whom you raised with love, transforms into a person who no longer has the best interests of their father or mother in mind, but only their own interests. This is precisely how the story of Karl Schneider begins, an elderly man from Munich, whose life is suddenly pushed in a direction he never imagined possible, and yet, at that moment, he has no idea that his own son is capable of things that will not only break his heart, but also nearly take away the home he and his late wife had built over decades of hard work. Stay tuned, because what begins as a perfectly ordinary argument between father and son develops into a shattering battle for dignity, justice, and freedom. Karl Schneider was no ordinary man. He had worked hard all his life, first as a mechanic, later as a workshop manager in a medium-sized company. His life was characterized by stability, and his greatest treasure was not money or fame, but the house he and his wife Helga had bought and lovingly renovated in the 1970s. This house, with its small back garden, apple trees and faded but sturdy wooden beams, was not a possession for him in the material sense. It was the heart of his family, a place full of memories, a place where his son Thomas had grown up. Every room bore stories, every wall was a silent witness to past decades. After Helga's death, the house was more than just a roof over his head for Karl. It was a connection to her, a kind of living memorial to their time together. The photos on the walls, the little handwritten notes Helga had once hung on the refrigerator, were like a silent companion to Karl. He sometimes spoke to her when he sat alone in the living room in the evenings, and he thought he still felt her warmth. The house meant home, security, memories, everything that gave him stability in his old age. But for Thomas, his only son, this house was nothing more than a valuable piece of property. Thomas had distanced himself from his parents at an early age. He was charming, eloquent, and knew how to win people over. But behind this facade lay a character that many of his friends and business partners only recognized later. Selfish, manipulative, and driven by a constant hunger for recognition and possessions. As Karl grew older and his strength waned, Thomas saw his opportunity. With gentle words, he began to convince his father that it would be sensible to place responsibility for the house in younger hands. "Dad, you know how complicated everything becomes when you get older. Imagine if you got sick. Who would take care of everything then? The bills, the insurance, the repairs, that's not for you anymore. Let me take care of it. It would be much easier." To outsiders, that sounded like caring. But between the lines, a completely different tone resonated. Control, pressure, a subliminal command. Karl sensed this, even if he didn't immediately admit it to himself. It was that feeling when your own decisions are slowly no longer your own, when someone else is setting the direction and you're just silently following along. The first few times Thomas brought up the subject, Karl evaded it. "I'm still fine," he said. "I'm managing." But Thomas persisted. Again and again he brought the conversation back to the house, sometimes casually, sometimes deliberately. He talked about how Karl finally needed to let go, how it made no sense to hold on to things he couldn't keep forever. And then the day came when Thomas let his guard down a bit. He no longer just talked about practical solutions or concern for his father. He began to subtly put pressure on Karl. "You know, Dad, other fathers your age have long since sorted everything out. You don't want strangers to end up making decisions about your house, do you? Imagine how chaotic it will all be once you're no longer here. I just want to help you." For Karl, this was a stab in the heart, not because he was afraid of death. He had learned that life is finite, but because for the first time he sensed that his son wasn't speaking of love, but of possession. It was as if Thomas wasn't seeing the person, but only the inheritance, not the father, but only the house. From then on, the topic became increasingly present. Thomas began to appear unannounced at his father's house more often. He brought real estate agent brochures, showed figures and calculations, and talked about values and collateral. Carl listened, often remaining silent and trying not to show his inner turmoil. But a fear grew within him that he could hardly name, the fear that he might gradually lose control over his own life. And while Thomas outwardly played the caring son, he began to plot behind the scenes. He believed it was only a matter of time before Carl would be weak enough to sign. What Thomas didn't know was that a resistance was stirring within his father, quiet, silent, but determined. Carl may have been old, but he wasn't prepared to give up what meant to his life without a fight. But nothing had been decided yet. Thomas was still playing his game, still building up the pressure bit by bit. And Carl, who suddenly felt like a guest in his own four walls, knew this was just the beginning of a battle that would put his heart and soul to the test. The conversations between Carl and Thomas, which had initially begun as casual hints, gradually transformed into an oppressive routine. Every meeting, every phone call, every lunch invitation seemed to eventually lead to the same thing: the house. For Carl, home, once a place of security, increasingly became a stage on which a power game he never intended was played out. Thomas was a master at choosing his words so that they sounded caring to the outside world. He portrayed himself as the responsible son who only wanted the best for his elderly father. But in reality, every conversation was an attack on Carl's self-determination. He spoke of supposed loneliness, of the dangers of old age, of his inability to manage his finances. "Dad, I'm worried," he said with feigned gentleness. "You're almost 80. If something happens to you, who's going to take care of everything? I have the experience. I can take care of it." To neighbors or acquaintances who overheard a conversation, Thomas seemed like a model of caring, but as soon as the doors were closed, the tone changed. Gentle pleas turned into demands. Apparent concern turned into pressure. Carl noticed how his son was gradually trying to disempower him. It started with small things. Thomas suddenly took over the organization of minor repairs without being asked. He placed bills on the kitchen table that Carl claimed he could no longer keep track of. He began using his own keys to the house as if it were already his. More and more often he appeared unannounced at the door, checking the refrigerator, the mail, and commenting on the tidiness of the living room. For Carl, it felt as if he was slowly being pushed out of his own life. The spaces he had once shared with his wife suddenly seemed alien, as if they were no longer truly his. The trust he had wanted to place in Thomas turned into mistrust. But that wasn't enough. Thomas began deliberately inducing guilt. He reminded Carl of how much he supposedly did for him. "Without me, you wouldn't have made it after Mom's death. I was always there, Dad. Now it's your turn to give something back to me." It was a perfidious reversal of reality, because in truth, Thomas had barely cared for Helga in the first few years after her death. But Carl, who was lonely and still felt a desire to have a good relationship with his son, often silently endured these accusations. The escalation continued when Thomas began to involve other people in his play. At family gatherings, he spoke to relatives about his father's difficulties. He portrayed him as distracted, forgetful, someone who could no longer bear the responsibility for his own life. "It's hard for me to handle all this on my own," he would say, sighing theatrically, "but someone has to do it." For Carl, this was a double humiliation. He not only gradually lost control of his house, but also his standing within the family. Some began to believe Thomas. They saw Carl as an old man who had lost touch with reality. Yet it wasn't Carl's memory that was failing, but his trust, which was systematically destroyed. The conversations about the house now became more direct. Thomas spoke openly about how Carl finally had to sign the papers. "It's just a formality," he said, already placing a pen on the table. "Don't worry, I'll take care of everything. But another strength grew within Carl. He remembered the words of his wife Helga, who had always encouraged him to stay strong, no matter how great the pressure. "You have to stand up for yourself, Carl," she had often said. He heard that voice now, sitting alone in the living room. But Thomas didn't give up. He began to make the meetings increasingly confrontational. One evening, as the wind blew through the old windows and Carl was serving tea, Thomas said in a cutting tone, "You know, Dad, if you refuse to hand over responsibility, you'll end up all alone. I won't have time to take care of you forever. And believe me, the neighbors won't be there for you either." It was no longer a request, it was a threat. From that moment on, Carl knew he was in a fight he hadn't chosen. The son he had loved, raised, and supported was now systematically trying to break him. It wasn't just the fear of losing the house anymore. It was the fear of losing himself, his dignity, his voice, his freedom. But Thomas had no idea that Carl was quietly beginning to search for ways to protect himself. He spoke little about it, but a resolve was growing within him. He didn't want to be the old man who ended up defenseless. He could still think, nor could he act, and he would do it, even though he knew the fight against his son's manipulation would be harder than he could ever imagine. What Thomas didn't know, the moment he thought he had gained the upper hand, his father was preparing to reshuffle the deck. But before this surprising turn of events could happen, Carl had to go through the most difficult phase of his life, a phase in which he learned that it's not age that makes you weak, but silence. It was a cool autumn morning when Carl Schneider decided to no longer be a mere spectator of his own life. For weeks, he had endured his son's attacks, subtle remarks, and outright threats. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the house creaked and memories of Helga kept him company, a thought grew within him that slowly became a certainty. If he didn't act now, he would lose everything. Not only the walls and the garden, but also the dignity he had preserved over a long life. Thomas, on the other hand, was convinced he had already won. He treated the house as his own, told acquaintances that he would soon have everything sorted out, and saw in his father's eyes only the weakness he believed he could exploit. His arrogance prevented him from even considering that Carl might still be capable of making his own plans. But Carl wasn't ready to be broken. Weeks earlier, without saying a word, he had followed the advice of an old friend, Mr. Bauer, a former colleague who now worked as a lawyer. At a discreet meeting in a small law firm in downtown Munich, Carl had told him everything about the constant pressure, the threats, the fear of being evicted from his own home. Bauer listened attentively, asked precise questions, and finally promised to find a solution that would surprise Thomas. So it came about that Carl quietly did something his son would never have suspected. He transferred the house to a foundation whose purpose was to preserve the building and garden for cultural purposes. The house was intended to serve as a meeting place for the community, a memorial to the Schneider family's history, and as an open space for events. This made it clear that no individual, not even Thomas, could ever gain sole control over it. Carl reserved the right of residence for life, secured by notarized contracts. No one could evict him from the house as long as he lived. And even after his death, the house was not to be sold, but continued as part of the foundation. For Thomas, this meant that all his plans to sell the house for a profit or to use it for his own purposes were dashed in one fell swoop. The decisive moment came one evening when Thomas appeared again with prepared papers. He had scheduled an appointment with a notary and spoke in a tone that brooked no argument. "Tomorrow, Dad, you'll finally sign. That's enough now. You know it's the best thing for all of us." He placed the documents on the table as if the matter had long been decided. Carl looked at him for a long time. There was no longer any fear in his gaze, but a calmness that irritated Thomas. Then Carl spoke firmly. "Thomas, you can stop. Everything's already taken care of." At first, Thomas didn't understand. He laughed derisively. Settled? You mean you've thought about it? Stop it, Dad. That's ridiculous. You're too old to decide that on your own. But then Carl pulled out a simple folder. Inside were copies of the foundation documents, the notarial deed, and the confirmation from the land registry. With calm movements, he placed the sheets in front of his son. The house no longer belongs to me. It now belongs to a foundation. I have a lifelong right of residence, and after me, this house will remain a place for the people here in Munich. Your plans no longer have a place here. Thomas stared at the documents as if he couldn't believe what he was reading. His facade began to crumble. The usually self-confident, manipulative son suddenly seemed helpless, almost childlike. You couldn't have done that, he stammered. This is my inheritance. It's my right. Inheritance is not a right of ownership as long as I live, Carl replied in a calm but determined voice. And I will not allow what your mother and I built to be destroyed or sold. This house will remain what it always was, a place full of memories and a home that is bigger than your ego. The words hit Thomas like a blow. For the first time, he was speechless. He had believed he could control his father through pressure and manipulation. But now he faced reality. His game was over, and he had lost. The moment of change wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic in any outward sense. There were no screams, no grand gestures. But in his father's quiet determination lay a power that was stronger than any threat. Carl had not only saved the house, he had also regained his dignity. From that day on, the relationship between father and son was forever changed. Thomas could barely bear his defeat. He raged, accused his father, and spoke of betrayal. But all of this bounced off Carl, for he now knew he was not defenseless. He was not the victim his son wanted him to be. He was a man who, at the decisive moment, had found the courage to reshuffle the deck. And while Thomas lost himself in his hurt, Carl began to feel a new sense of calm within himself. For the first time since Helga's death, he no longer felt at the mercy of others. He had taken action. He had set boundaries. And he knew this decision would not only protect him, but also leave a mark that would extend beyond his own life. But the story didn't end there. What followed was a clash that would not only finally reveal Thomas's true face, but also demonstrate how deeply narcissism and greed can lead a person to ruin. The revelation of the foundation had reshuffled the deck. But what was a liberation in Carl's eyes meant a humiliation for Thomas that he could barely bear. In the days following that evening, there was no peace. Thomas repeatedly appeared at the door, sometimes with loud accusations, sometimes with feigned conciliation, but behind every visit was the same desperate attempt to regain control. "Dad, you can't be serious," he said one Sunday morning, appearing unannounced in the living room. "You've let someone influence you. It's not you. I'm your son. I have a right to this house." Carl, sitting in his chair and opening the newspaper, looked at him calmly. "You have no right, Thomas. An inheritance is a gift, not a right. And you've shown in the last few months that you don't know how to handle a gift." These words finally broke Thomas's mask. His face twisted, his voice cracked. "You're an old man. You don't know what you're doing. Everyone will see that you've lost your mind." But the exact opposite happened. In the weeks that followed, word spread throughout the neighborhood and the family. They learned that Carl had donated his house to a foundation to preserve it for the community. And they also heard how Thomas had tried to manipulate his own father to acquire the property. While Thomas had previously cultivated the image of a caring son, a different image now began to emerge. Relatives who had previously believed him turned their backs. Neighbors who had always greeted him politely suddenly looked at him with suspicion. His facade crumbled, and he could no longer hold it together. For Carl, however, this development brought back something he had almost thought he had lost: his dignity. When he walked through his neighborhood, people greeted him respectfully. Some patted him on the shoulder, some quietly admired his courage. Not many would have had the strength to defend themselves like that, he once heard a neighbor say. Carl just nodded, but inside he felt a warmth he had long missed. The foundation he had established slowly began to take shape. Small meetings were held in the garden, a local music group rehearsed there, and a historical society planned to document the house's history. Where Thomas had only seen money, a place of life and community was now emerging. Carl often watched the events from his window, thinking of Helga. "You would have loved that," he sometimes whispered. Thomas, on the other hand, withdrew more and more. His attempts to take legal action against the foundation failed. No court could grant him the rights he demanded. The contracts were too clear, the decisions Carl had made in a timely manner too unequivocal. The reality was inexorable. He had lost. And yet Thomas couldn't bear the thought that his own father had set a limit for him. His insults erupted into rage, which he sometimes shouted out loud when he was alone. But with each day that his power over Carl dwindled, it became clearer that he hadn't defeated his father, but himself. For Carl, this realization was both painful and liberating. He had hoped that one day Thomas would show understanding, that he would realize how much his greed was destroying him. But now he knew some people don't change, and sometimes the greatest strength lies not in saving others, but in protecting oneself. On a winter evening, as the first snow fell and the neighborhood lights glowed warmly through the windows, Carl sat by the fireplace and wrote a letter, not to Thomas, but to the foundation, to the people who would continue to run the house after him. It read, "This house should not be just walls and rooms. It should be a testimony that dignity cannot be sold, that memory is stronger than greed, and that a person, even when they are old, has the right to say no." This letter was later framed and hung in the entrance area of the house. Anyone who entered the place could read the words. Many visitors paused before it, some smiling, some becoming thoughtful. For Carl, it was a silent legacy that transcended his own story. The lesson of this story lay not only in Thomas's defeat, it lay in the clarity Carl had found, that age is not a weakness, as long as you have the courage to set boundaries. That manipulation only works if you remain silent. And that sometimes the greatest freedom lies in letting go without giving up. Thus, the battle ended not in a broken relationship or resignation, but in a quiet triumph. Carl had not only saved his home, but also rediscovered his inner strength. And while Thomas remained trapped in his bitterness, Carl lived on, with his head held high, with the memory of his wife, and with the certainty that he had done the right thing. Because in the end, it's not what you own that remains, but what you leave behind. And Carl Schneider left behind something greater than any legacy, an example of courage, dignity, and the strength to stand up to a narcissist. Sometimes, it's not life's big struggles that change us, but the quiet moments in which we find the courage to say no. Carl's story shows that dignity and self-determination remain inviolable even in old age if you're willing to stand up for yourself. Perhaps you too know people who have had to stand up against manipulation or are facing a decision themselves. If you want to experience more such moving stories that touch us and give us hope, then subscribe to the channel now, like this video, and don't miss the next stories that will surprise you.